See, it's not all light and fluffy around here. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife, and today I am taking you through some of the heaviest books that I have read across my life. I am known across my friendship group for reading a lot of really light, really fluffy, romance, contemporary, that kind of thing. But I do kind of go out of my roadhouse a little bit now and then. I have read a couple of thrillers across my life. I've read a couple of nonfiction books that have truly sat with me for such a long time. These books might be a good idea if you want something that's going to stay with you over the Halloween period, if you want something that's going to make you feel a little bit uneasy, if you want something that's going to unsettle you a little bit, but you don't want the gore, you don't want the violence, you don't want the kind of psychological things that a horror or a thriller can bring to you sometimes. Let's start out with what's probably the hardest book on this list, and that is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Chanel was raped by Brock Turner when she was on her college campus in, I think, maybe 2015. And this is her account of the attack itself. This is her account of what happened to her afterwards, of the court case that she had, and also what it was like for her to live under this cloak of anonymity while everything was still being discussed. After the court case, we discovered that Emily Doe was actually Chanel Miller, and this book is really strikingly written. I can't think of any other word that's going to describe it. This book will really sit with you for such a long time, but of course it does come with a huge trigger warning for rape and for sexual assault and for victim blaming and victim shaming. So if that is something that you are a little bit iffy about, if that is something that you can't read at the moment, completely fine and protect your peace. But if Chanel's life is something that you would like to learn a little bit more about, I definitely recommend this book. Next up is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This is one of the most hard-hitting debuts I think I've ever read. This book follows Vanessa, who is about 31 years old at the start of the novel, and we learn that when she was 17, she was in a relationship with her teacher, Staines. He was her English teacher, and I think she was at a boarding school. Everything now is starting to come to light about how Vanessa was not the only student with whom he had a sexual relationship with, and other students who he had targeted are now coming out to say that this wasn't okay, they didn't want this to happen, they were never okay with what he had done or said to them. And Vanessa doesn't see it as the rest of them do. Vanessa sees it as a completely consensual, loving, sexual and romantic relationship. And it's a really great look at the Me Too movement. It's a really great look at power imbalances in relationships. It's a really damning look on the power imbalance between a teacher and a student in a relationship together. I also found it really interesting to read it from Vanessa's point of view when she was somebody who didn't see this as anything that was wrong. She didn't see anything that was bad about it. She just genuinely saw it as a loving and healthy relationship. And then you can see the doors start to open, you can see the light starting to come in, and that's a really, really interesting take to have on it. Next up is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue, and this is one that I had to put off for a couple of months because of when it is set. This book was published in 2020, and it just so happened to be a pandemic book. This book was set during the Spanish flu pandemic, during 1918, 1919. And it is also set in a maternity hospital in Dublin. So not only are these women coming in with influenza symptoms, they're also coming in with pregnancies. They're coming in with stillborns. They're coming in with miscarriages. All of that mixed in together makes this such a heartbreaking story at times. Of course, there are characters who you lose along the way. Of course, there are characters who you grow to love and you grow to really want for them and you grow to cheer on them. And then they end up losing their lives in the course of this book. The book follows Julia, who is a nurse in the hospital. I think it's the Rotunda, but it could also have been Holles Street, both of which are actually maternity hospitals in Dublin. And it was so interesting to see what it was like to try and bring new life into the world, to try and keep everything going in that sense, especially when it had just come after World War I and everything was still on its head from a flu pandemic. It does kind of mirror what had happened in 2020, except we'd had quite a lot of medical advancements in those 100 years, thankfully. But it was so interesting and so striking to read that book around the same time that we were just kind of coming onto the curve of getting over COVID. Next up is one that genuinely surprised one of my friends that I had enjoyed it, and that is Strange Sally Diamond by Liz Nugent. I recommended this to Michelle from Michelle's Library, and she messaged me and she said, "This is genuinely not a book for you. How did you end up loving this?" And the thing is that Liz's writing just grips me. It just drags me into it. As you can imagine from the title, this is following Sally Diamond, who is a little bit of an outsider in her community. She was adopted as a child, and we find that out when her father passes away. He had told her when she was younger that when he did die, he just wanted to be brought out with the family's rubbish. So Sally takes him for his word, and when he does eventually pass away, she brings him into the family's incinerator. But this brings in an entire media circus around Sally. She doesn't know that anything that she has done there is wrong. She's just carrying out her father's final wishes as she had thought they had been. But we learn a whole lot more about Sally's background. We learn about her birth. We learn about her early upbringing. We learn about who her birth mother really was and the relationship between her birth mother and her birth father and how that may not have been the best relationship anybody had been in. This book has been kind of described by Michelle as Room meets Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. If you enjoyed both of those books, this one is truly going to knock you over. Next up is Bear Town by Fredrik Backman. This is a translation of the Swedish original, and it does also come with a trigger warning for rape. It also comes with a trigger warning for victim blaming, sexual assault, and also for kind of hero worship of the perpetrator. This is set in a small fictional town in Sweden called Beartown, where hockey is king. The hockey team is basically untouchable. Nothing that they have ever done is wrong. They cannot be touched by the law, except that one of them is now caught up in a rape and sexual assault case. The whole town is now going through a he said versus she said. What do I think is right versus what is actually right? And this was such an interesting read. This was such a gripping and phenomenal read. I had originally planned to buddy read this with Paige from Pages with Paige, and both of us kind of gave up on it at the time we'd originally said, and then both of us ended up coming back to it independently and both giving it 5 stars. Because of the kind of northern Swedish, rural, isolated setting, I think this actually works really well if you're sitting by the fire, if you have like a blanket wrapped around you and a cozy hot drink beside you. I think that will kind of bring a little bit of cheer back to you when you're reading it, because this book is pretty heavy. There are 2 other books in the series. There is Us Against Them and there is The Winners. And I know that The Winners is like a hugely chunky book. I think the audiobook of it is like 21 hours long. So I need to really psych myself up to read it. Not just because of what I think the topic of it is, but also because of just how long it is. A similar book, but written for a YA audience, is Asking for It by Louise O'Neill. This book follows Emma, who is a really popular but not very well liked person living in a small village in County Cork. The local sports team has just won a county final, which is a huge thing in any community. I know for myself that when I'm at home and my local sports team wins any kind of big game, there is always a big party afterwards. There is a bonfire. There, you go to the pub, you have some drinks with everybody there. The next morning, Emma wakes up on her parents' lawn. She is basically wearing just her underwear. She has no idea how she has gotten there, but everyone has got photos of her from the party in very compromising positions. Again, because the people involved are on the sports team and they've just won their county final, they're basically untouchable. Everybody goes into, well, she shouldn't have been wearing this. Well, she shouldn't have been acting like this. She was asking for it. I read this when it came out. I think it was about 2013, 2014, and it really struck me. I think this is a book that should be in pretty much every school library for teenagers. I think it's something that they will really take a lot out of in the terms of consent, in the terms of victim blaming and victim shaming. I think it's a really interesting conversation to have with teenagers, especially those who are considering having sex for the first time. I think it's a really important conversation to have, and this book might be one to start it off. Finally is another pandemic book, but this one actually does take place during COVID. It is a non-fictional telling of what happened in Ireland during the COVID pandemic. This is A State of Emergency, written by Richard Chambers. He is a journalist working with Virgin Media, one of our TV channels. And he basically went around the country interviewing people who had been affected by COVID in some way. Either they were the first person to have the vaccine in Ireland, or they knew the first person who had brought it into the country, or they were working on the front line, families of people who had been working on the front line and had lost their lives to COVID. I had been living out of Ireland for the entirety of the pandemic. I'd been in Germany for the entirety of the pandemic, but I had obviously been watching the news back at home, hoping for my family, not just my immediate family, but my entire family circle and my friendship circle, that everything was doing well. I had been watching the numbers so that I knew, okay, it might be safe for me to come back for a couple of weeks and visit everybody. But reading these first-hand accounts of what it was actually like in Ireland when the numbers went absolutely sky high in December 2020, January 2021, when the vaccine started to come in, when the pandemic was just starting to even happen in the first place. It's very sobering. It's not something that I would read if you are still having a little bit of PTSD about COVID in any way, but if you think that you can stomach it, I definitely recommend looking into it. Those are some of the heaviest books that I have read in recent years. What book have you read that has stuck with you for any kind of a reason? If you'd love to leave me a comment but you can't think of anything you'd like to say, then just leave me the ton weight emoji. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.